We'll just drill right into the next topic, which happens to be wells and water wells, and pretty much anything wells. So we'll get right into that. My name's Jim Goddard. I manage the well and geothermal program here at the division. And you might be wondering, why is there so much to do with wells? And actually there is, and it's kind of a unique situation with the state engineer's office in that the state engineer, the Division of Water Rights, regulates well drillers. We license and regulate them, and that's kind of unique because every other occupation or industry that requires a license is regulated by the Division of Occupational and Professional Licensing, except for well drilling. So it's kind of unique that way. And the reason is the legislature wanted to make sure the state engineer was over this type of work in order to protect the resource, the groundwater. So that's kind of the reason why we're going to go into so much about wells. And I was told I could go as long as I want to talk about well drilling. And I'll drill as deep as I can. It might get boring, but I'll take it a bit at a time. But I wanted to get all of those puns out of the way, so you won't hear another pun from me about well drilling for the rest of the talk. So the topics I'm going to be discussing today are the status of well drilling in Utah. Just some information that's not going to be on the test, but just give you an idea of what's going on with well drilling. The permitting process to get a permit to drill a well. How do you do well renovations, replacements, and abandonments, and the process to get permits to do those. Also talk a little bit about non-production wells, which the state engineer's office also regulates, not just water wells, but non-production wells, because they can also impact groundwater just like a production well does. Pump installation requirements, general administrative rules, and general construction rules, and some little bit of information on our website about wells, even though there's more information on our website coming up tomorrow. Okay, so just for your information, right now, and this is a little bit different than your handbook or your booklet because I've updated that information, so it is a little bit more updated. We have 152 licensed drillers currently in the state and 127 licensed pump installers and 251 registered operators. So that's who we regulate to make sure that they follow the rules and protect the groundwater. Last year, we had 508 non-production wells drilled, and 41% of those were heat pump wells, and I'll talk a little bit more about what kind of wells those are in a little bit, and 475 production wells. As you can see the distribution there of what types of wells, most of them are just small irrigation, domestic stock wells, 6-inch wells, very small, and you can see towards the bottom, only 4% are public supply wells that are drilled, and you can see the distribution there as well. So usually we have a lot more non-production wells, but 2008 was kind of a slow year for those. Here's just a graph that kind of shows the distribution. Green is non-production wells, red are production wells. You can see how it's varied. In the past 12, 15 years or so, we've had a huge influx in non-production wells, most of those being ground source heat pump wells, wells that are used for heating, cooling of buildings such as schools, public buildings and whatnot. So you can see there's been just a huge growth in that industry. It dropped off last year for some reason, I'm not sure why, but it's already picked up this year. So a lot of non-production wells going on, and we had a big slump in 2008 of all sorts of drilling, especially public or especially water wells, when the economy kind of tanked. A lot of people just couldn't afford to drill wells anymore, and so it started to pick up a little bit. We're kind of evening off around 500 wells a year for that. This graph kind of shows the distribution over a lot longer period of time. The data I would probably trust from about 1960 on. Before that, our collection wasn't that well. But since then, you can see there's been huge fluctuations for a lot of different reasons, and you can see it's actually starting to come up a little bit in the last few years, which is a good sign for our industry that we regulate the well drillers. In terms of how they're drilled, you can see the distribution here. There's a lot of different types of drilling methods that are used in Utah. Mud rotary, cable tool, air rotary are probably the most common. Air rotary being the most common, you can see it over 41%. But we still have a lot of cable tool wells drilled in the state, which is kind of an ancient method that is still applicable, and a lot of drillers in Utah still use that technology. If you want to know more about drilling methods, I have a whole day class. If you want to invite me to come, I can talk all you want about well drilling methods and how wells are drilled in Utah. We do have some other minor methods, flooded reverse, and some other methods, but most of the water wells are drilled with air rotary, cable tool, and mud rotary drilling methods. So how do you get a permit or authorization to do well drilling activity? Drill a well, replace it, renovate it, all of those aspects. What is the process? There are a lot of application or permitting mechanisms. You can see here: application to appropriate, change application, exchange, temporary change application. All of those are related to the application of the water right itself. When that application is approved, you get what we call a start card, or the permit to drill the well, that you can give to the driller and do that. So it's not a separate process to get a well permit. If you file those types of water right applications, if it's approved, then you get the permission to drill that well. Provisional wells or rush lettered, I'll talk more about that. Well renovation, well replacement, and non-production wells. All of those will lead to some permit to either drill or modify or renovate or replace a well. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this because it was already discussed in a lot better detail than I could provide earlier today. The approval for a water right in terms of filing the application, review, advertising, protest period, potentially a hearing, and then the memo decision. If that is approved, with that memo decision, the start cards and the letter authorizing drilling the well is available with that. So that's already been discussed. As far as how much that costs, the fee for a water right application is based on the quantity of water needed for the wells, and that's all part of the water right application and the fees for that. Non-production well applications, there are no fees for that. That's a free process to get a non-production well application, as well as there are no fees for renovate and replacement applications. And I'm just going to skip over that. One thing I will say with this is a map showing the areas that are either closed to appropriation, restricted, or still open. A lot of people ask, well, since we've closed the population corridor in red there, have we seen a decline in drilling wells? And actually, we haven't. We've had just as many wells drilled in those areas as the open areas. It's just the permits are done through exchanges or change applications, temporary applications, things like that. So still plenty of drilling going on in the red. It's just a little different process to get the permit. So a little more detail on those processes. So an application to renovate is fairly easy. At the end of the presentation, I'll show you our website where you can find all of these forms that I'm about to talk about. But the application to renovate an existing well, if you want to change the well or modify it itself, deepen, put in a liner, screen, perforations, anything that's going to change the nature of the well itself requires a renovate permit through our office. It doesn't grant approval to replace the well. It used to be, if you, 20 years ago, if you filed an application to renovate, we automatically gave you authorization to replace the well if the renovate didn't work. We don't do that anymore. It's a separate process because we were missing a lot of the paperwork coming back from the drillers when they would renovate and then replace it. We would never get the replacement well information. So it's a separate process now. There is no fee for that, and one kind of the conditions of approving those is that the title and ownership needs to be updated on those before we issue that. So we get that question and that concern a lot as somebody who's purchased a new water right or purchased property and they never updated their title, and then they want to renovate or replace the well. They have to go through that process before we'll approve it. And it allows for repair, renovation, or deepening, as I mentioned, and a separate application for replacement. Here's something that's important to understand: what kind of work on the well requires a Renovate permit and what doesn't require a permit. Basically, if you're going to be changing the nature of the well itself by deepening it, repairing it, renovating the well or the casing, anytime the well itself is modified, a permit is needed. But if you're just going in the well to clean it, develop it, disinfect it, test, do any pump work, a Renovate permit is not required. So that's a change that happened about in 2011. And it made it a lot easier, a lot less paperwork that you have to do. I noticed from the previous talk most of you are related to public water suppliers or systems, and so this is very helpful that you don't need to get a permit to clean the well or change out the pump or do anything like that. It's still regulated, still needs to be done by a licensed driller or a licensed pump installer, but you don't have to have a start card to do that kind of work. And the driller or the pump installer still needs to submit the log for that work after the fact. They just don't have to have a start card. As far as a well replacement, if you want to replace the well, again, in the same application, some of the conditions of those replacements are that the well has to be within 150 feet of the old well. We get a question a lot, is that 150 feet from the point of diversion on the paper, or is it 150 feet from the physical well? And it's really the physical well, because as you know, a lot of times the well is not exactly where the point of diversion is on the water right. So it has to be within 150 feet of the physical well. If it's over that, then a change application might need to be required in order to get the approval to replace that. It's the owner's responsibility, and it's a condition of the approval. It's the owner's responsibility to have a licensed driller abandon the existing well. That's one of the conditions that is bold on our approval letter, that by granting this authority, you're required to abandon, seal up basically the old well. There's no fee, and again, like before, the title and ownership needs to be current. And we track both of those logs. We make sure we get the abandonment log back from the driller as well as the new well log for the replacement well. And if we don't get those logs back, then we're checking with the driller, and if the driller says, well, the owner has refused to allow me to abandon that well, then we'll come back to the owner and find out why. And there is some enforcement ability. We can try to help that process, or a lot of times we'll see that the owner will actually file a change application and put some water rights back in the well if they still want to use it for whatever the purpose. But most of the times that a well is replaced, the existing well is not usable anyway, so it needs to be abandoned. So a reason for not abandoning a well is that they can't afford it, and that doesn't fly with us. We won't allow that. The well abandonment process, let me talk a little bit about that. As far as the way we define well abandonment, it's when the well is completely sealed from bottom to top. It's not just that it's abandoned and left alone and thrown rocks or posts or whatever in it. That's not how we define abandonment. It's when it's completely sealed up from bottom to top. It has to be done by a licensed well driller, especially if it's deeper than 30 feet, the well. There is a category of a temporary abandonment, and that can apply when somebody's drilling a well and for whatever reason they can't find water, and they go to a certain point and they run out of money, or they need to study it more and find more geology, or whatever the case. They can apply for a temporary abandonment where the well has to be properly capped and sealed, but it can be just left in that state for up to 90 days. And then after 90 days, it would either need to continue to be completed or abandoned. So there is that possibility there. As far as standalone abandonment, so when a well is replaced, that process is dealt with through the replacement process. But if somebody just wants to abandon a well that's not related to a change application or a replacement well application, it's old, it's a burden, it's a danger, it just needs to be abandoned, we don't require a permit or authorization for that. It does need to be done by a licensed driller, and that driller needs to notify us before they do it, so we have the opportunity to inspect and give that driller an abandonment log to fill out and turn into us. But for a standalone abandonment, a permit is not required for that. So moving on to non-production wells that we regulate. The type of wells that we regulate for non-production wells include test wells. If somebody wants to drill a test well to find out where the water is, how much water's there, the quality of the water, they might do a test well. So we regulate those and permit those. Cathodic protection wells, closed-loop heat exchange wells, monitoring wells are some of the wells that we regulate. There are more than that, but those are probably the most common wells that we regulate that aren't used for production of water. And the process for that is to file a non-production well construction request form. Again, there's no fee. Those are processed through our well drilling office here in Salt Lake, or any of the regional offices will process those. It can take us up to, well, it usually doesn't take us that long, but there's up to 14 days to review that. And that 14 days is there primarily to allow the public, if they're concerned with any non-production well projects, to be able to review that and express their concerns and contact the applicant to work through a solution. And we've had problems with that where somebody will go in and put in a non-production well system, like 100 or so heat pump wells right next to a public supply well. Well, it would have been helpful for that public supplier to know that that system was going in so that they could work with it. In this case, no notification was given, and the non-production wells contaminated the production well. And it's working again, but it's not ever probably going to be to the same capacity that it was before that non-production well project went in right next to it. So there is a listing that we have on our website, and I'll show at the end where that is, where anybody can go in and see who's applied for non-production wells and find out who it is, who the contact information is, where the wells are, how big the project is. All that information is provided on our website. Just to clarify a point of confusion that we often hear about a type of non-production wells that we define as heat exchange wells. These are wells that are drilled in order to use the heat in the earth, in the water, to produce heating and cooling in buildings. They can be done for residential, or it can be done for big buildings, schools, public buildings, commercial buildings, things like that. We define those two different ways, either a closed loop system, which is by far the most common, or open loop system. A closed loop system is truly non-production. They're not pulling out any groundwater. They drill a hole in the ground, put in the loop, which is HDPE pipe, poly pipe, looped in the ground, and then they completely seal that in place. They're not pulling any groundwater out, and then within those loops they circulate either water or a food-grade glycol, and basically use the heat transfer to either put heat in the ground or pull heat out of the ground for heating and cooling the buildings. So those are fairly common. And as far as the types of heat exchange wells, those are the most common. But we also have open loop systems where they actually do drill a well, just like any other kind of a water well, and they pump water out, run it through the heat exchanger at the surface, and then re-inject it back into the same aquifer. Those are open loop systems, and we do not consider those non-production wells. Those are considered production wells, and they do require a water right, a non-consumptive use water right, but nevertheless it is required. So that's a big difference that we see for those two types of wells, and we get a lot of questions because people want to simply do a non-production well application for an open loop system, and that's not allowed. So another point of confusion we get, we call them heat exchange wells. The industry often calls them ground source heat pumps, but a lot of times there might be another term called geothermal that's related to these wells. And just so you're clear, by our definition at Water Rights, geothermal is a whole different thing. We have a whole set of rules for what we term as geothermal. So by our definition, if it's geothermal, it's used for power production, energy production. In other words, it's hot. It's over 120 degrees C. So that's the definition that we have for geothermal, is water that's over 120 degrees Celsius. Then it falls into a different category of geothermal and regulated by a different set of rules, which our division also regulates. Provisional wells or rush letter wells, these are fairly common. It basically allows somebody to drill a water well before the water right application is complete, or the change or exchange, whatever the case. So if somebody has a valid reason that they need to start drilling a well before the application is approved, this is one way you can do it, by following this process. But it is granted at the owner's risk, because you can drill a well, and if it turns out the application is denied or not approved, then you're out there with a well that doesn't have a water right and would need to be abandoned or properly taken care of. We like this because it's not a non-production well, but when you file for a rush letter, it's linked to the water right database. So there's no confusion after a non-production well is done to make sure we link it to the water right. It's already linked to the water right when you do that process. So you file, there's no specific application other than when you file the application, the change, whatever the case, that you also request a rush letter or provisional approval to be able to start drilling. It's not a slam dunk. We look at a lot of things to make sure that it's okay, but it is a possibility to start drilling before that water right application is processed. There is a code, and I'm not going to read that like the others. You can read it out in your booklets, but there's the code that gives the state engineer authority to grant that preliminary approval to start drilling with that. So well drilling rules, I'm not going to go a lot into this. As I mentioned, on the slide it's purple, but our new handbook is now red. We just updated the rules last year, and so that slide says September 2008, but the most recent is May 2018. So the rules were just recently revised. You can find a copy of this on our website, and I'll show at the end where you can find that. But I just quickly want to go, just for your information, over some of the major aspects of what we regulate. And when you hear complaints from the drillers about how we regulate them, you'll maybe have a better understanding of that, because it's important. It's important to protect the groundwater, and there are a lot of regulations to make sure that they're not just putting holes in the ground, but they're protecting the resource from being contaminated so that others can't use it. The scope of these rules, as you can see there, applying both to production wells and non-production wells, where we would regulate it and a license would be required to do that work, include any wells deeper than 30 feet deep. So that's kind of the criteria that we look at. If it's deeper than 30 feet, then these rules would apply to that work. It's permitted. You can see the different types of water wells that we permit or regulate: domestic irrigation, stock, public supply, commercial. Pretty much any well that you produce water from, we regulate those. And as far as non-production wells, again, it's the 30-foot criteria that we permit those. It's permitted through the non-production well process. Test wells, monitoring wells, I already mentioned those, but we also regulate wells like piezometers, inclinometers, anodes, if they're deeper than 30 feet, and if they impact an aquifer, we regulate those. What is excluded? What don't we regulate? If it's less than 30 feet, these rules don't regulate it, but a very important aspect of that is if it's less than 30 feet, it still requires a water right. This is one of the big confusions that we get related to what we regulate and what we don't, and that is because a lot of people think that they can just go into their backyard and drill a 25-foot well and use it to irrigate their lawn or whatever, and they don't need anything, and that's incorrect. They need a water right. Anytime you use water, You've heard many times today in the state of Utah you have to have a water right, whether that's surface water, shallow groundwater, or deeper groundwater. A water right is necessary. What you don't need to do is use a licensed driller. So you can drill or dig your own well that's less than 30 feet, and you don't have to have a licensed driller be involved in that. So that's a point of clarification right there. These rules also don't regulate geothermal wells. Another set of rules within our division regulates those, as you can see there. We don't regulate exploratory or geotechnical borings. Basically, if a boring is left open or cased, we regulate it. But if they're just punching a hole, taking a soil sample, and then sealing that back up immediately with the drill rig still on site, we don't regulate that. Permits aren't needed through us for that. And there may be other agencies that regulate those, but not us. If a well is located in a man-made feature, like a dam embankment or something like that, we don't regulate those. If it's dewatering wells not impacting the aquifer, then we also don't regulate those. It's important to understand the definition of well drilling, basically what we can regulate and what we can't. With respect to well drilling, the definition is well drilling means the act of drilling, constructing, repairing, renovating, deepening, cleaning, developing, or abandoning a well. So any type of activities like that are regulated if it's deeper than 30 feet. And then as of 2011, we also received direction from the legislature to start regulating and licensing pump installers. So that's a fairly new thing, only a few years old, but we also now regulate the installation of pumps. Some important aspects of the administrative rules, not the construction side of the rules, but as I mentioned, a license is required for drillers and pump installers, and it's a fairly rigorous process. They have to take hours and hours of tests and show experience, and they have to be bonded, and they have to have continuing education every year in order to renew. So it's a fairly rigorous process. They're regulated fairly heavily, and I'm sure they'll tell you that if you ask them. Their rigs, either a licensed driller has to be on site, or if they have operators under them that are registered through us, they can be on site as well. We have a process for violations, infractions, and enforcement that we have. A lot of different aspects you can see there. Reporting requirements are fairly stringent. Like I mentioned, start cards. The driller has to have a start card before they can start the work. They have to turn in a well log or an official driller's report within 30 days. And each log is specific to that well. We also require pump logs, abandonment reports, and the applicant card is something that the applicant or the owner submits after the well is drilled. As I mentioned just recently, we now have pump installation rules and licensing. A license is required to do any of those type of work, like changing out a pump, cleaning, disinfecting, all of those things. Pump installer's license now is required to do that. There is an exception to that in the statute, and that is if you do work on your own well, on your own property, you don't have to have a pump installer's license. You can do that on your own. So that basically, a lot of farmers like to do their own pumps and things like that. So the legislature put that exemption in there so that that's the case. So if you're doing it commercially for pay as a business, a license is required. But if you're doing your own well, it's not. To do pump work, there's no permit or start card that is required, other than the licensee has to do the work and that they're required to submit the pump log after the fact. And all that information is on our website. It's all public information. You can pull out well logs, pump logs, all that information is available to the public on our website. Just to mention, we don't regulate this, but we're closely involved with it, because we regulate kind of the same type of thing. There is an additional layer of regulation for public supply wells. As was mentioned before, they're also regulated through the Division of Drinking Water, so it's important to understand that We're separate. We have our rules that cover pretty much any wells, but they have an additional layer of rules for public supply wells specifically, and different processes to get those approved. So you can see some of those aspects there. I won't go into a lot of detail with that other than to say just make sure you check with them if you're a public supplier to make sure you have their approval to do that, because they don't get very happy when you drill a public supply well without getting pre-approval from them, which surprisingly happens quite often, to the point where just recently they changed their rules to allow them to fine a public water supplier for circumventing the process and drilling the well without getting approval. So I'm not sure if they've ever fined anybody yet, but it's in their rules. Just real quickly, a few construction requirements that are in probably the meat of this book or the rules. We require specific things for well casing, joints, screens, perforations, surface seals and interval seals, and that's probably the most important thing that we regulate. Those surface seals and interval seals, that's what protects the groundwater. That's what protects it from surface water impacting it. It protects it from poor quality aquifers impacting good quality aquifers. So we have a huge emphasis on making sure they're constructed properly so that there's no cross-contamination that's going on. And you can see a lot of other things, aquifer protection, the type of fluids and chemicals that drillers can use, lost circulation materials, cross-contamination, disinfection, a lot on just making sure that the well is protected. Surface completions, we do have some special requirements for special wells like public supply wells or heat pump wells and monitoring wells. We have requirements for deepening, rehabilitation, and renovation, and well abandonment, and just recently pump installation and repair requirements. So just with my last few minutes, I just want to quickly show you, if it will take me to the website. And it might not. Okay. I almost made it through without any technical difficulties, but so if you go to our homepage, all those forms that I refer to, if you go under resources and applications forms, and then probably everything you've heard about up until now is on the top part of these forms, but you'll have to scroll down to the well drilling forms. You can see non-production well construction, well renovation, well replacement, as well as pump installation reports. We get a lot of questions as why can't I just print a well log form here? Those aren't accessible to the public. We just can't print those off. So when we get an approval and a start card comes in, we pre-print with all the information on the water right on that well log and send it directly to the driller for that specific well. So they're well specific with that. So you can find those applications there. And then if you go down to the well drilling link, this is where you can find a ton of information. If you want the handbook, you click on there and you can download the handbook in PDF. All of this kind of stuff that I just talked about is kind of briefly described there. If you want to know who's licensed, that's the very first link. It lists all of those, as I mentioned, 152 licensed drillers, and you can drill into each one of those and get all their contact information, what they're licensed in, who their operators are, where they're currently active, and you can pull up all their well logs since they were ever licensed. So there can be hundreds and hundreds of logs that you'll be able to access through that. You can, with this drop down, you can change how you look at that. information. You can look at everybody who's ever had a license, even though they may not be currently licensed. You can look at operators. So a lot of different ways to look at that information. Other bits of good information here, you can access the rules, the well drilling database. If you go in there, it will allow you to do well log searches and put in certain criteria like depth or date or diameter, type of well. You can put that criteria in there to do well log searches. You can search by radius around a public land survey coordinate, PLS, or a UTM coordinate. If you want to look at well statistics, a lot of those slides that I showed, you'll be able to find that real time right here as well. I mentioned the non-production well application listing. So this is where anybody, this is open to the public, you can find out who's been submitting non-production well applications. You can drill into those and you can pull up a map and it'll show you where it is. This tells you whether it's been approved or unapproved. Here's just one of the first examples. They're planning on drilling, I think, 50 wells in this area that's for Ensign Services that's probably maybe 1,000 feet away from a public supply well. So that's something that will notify the public water system that this is happening and give them an opportunity to look into it a little bit closer. This is a good one, well drilling links. If you want information about well drilling, all the government agencies related to well drilling, the local associations of pump installers and drillers and the national associations are there, and a lot of good information on just general well information that well owners could really benefit from are located there. So with that, I'm not going to go into any more detail on the website, but I think I'll stop drilling right there and end the presentation. Any questions? All you want to know about drilling and more?
That was a good joke right there. Hey, so for tomorrow, we're going to start again at 8:30, and most of you are taking the exam, and I believe we'll get that started at about 1:30 or 2 o'clock. So everyone needs to make sure you bring a laptop or a tablet or some kind of device that gets on the internet. If you don't have one, and if you need one, we do have a couple we can provide for you. If any of you need some individual assistance during the test, then come up and talk to me tomorrow. I have credentials, username, and password that I will email to each of you tomorrow. Don't want anyone to try to get a jump start on the exam or anything. So any questions as far as looking forward to the exam tomorrow? Okay. Travel safe, and we'll see you in the morning. Thanks.